Unit 2, biodiversity. Let's get on it. So, there's a lot of species on this planet, and we really don't know exactly how many there are. They think they've cataloged about 1.5 million species, most of them insects and plants. Uh, but when they do their calculation, I think there's probably a lot more than that, maybe almost 10 times as many, so maybe like 13 million or so. We don't know. But the distribution of these species is highly uneven. That's one thing we should know, that the vast majority of the species we have actually live on land, about 75% of them. And of those species that live on land, almost 90% of them are located near the equator. So it's a very uneven distribution of species, but this diversity of life is what we're going to be studying in this unit. So biodiversity can mean several different things. It can be variability within an organism, within a species, within a community, and within between ecosystems. So let's start off thinking of it at the genetic level. So within a species, not all. Look, my hair, my hair looks funny. Uh, there's a level of genetic diversity that can be present. So for some species, for instance, cheetahs, most cheetahs in the world, their DNA is very similar to each other. There's not a lot of genetic diversity in uh, the cheetah population. So we'd say they have low genetic biodiversity. Other species have tremendous biodiversity in their genetic makeup. You can have species level. This is usually what we think of when we think of biodiversity. If there's lots of different species in an area, let's say a rainforest, we think of it having high biodiversity. We can also talk about the biodiversity of habitats present. So you could have an area where there is, like the state I come from, Washington, has a lot of habitat biodiversity. There's estuaries, there's boreal forests, there's tundra, there's desert, all these in a little area. And these systems do have a tendency to interact with each other. So we have high habitat level biodiversity. And it's worth pointing out, it's not limited to just natural systems. We can talk about the biodiversity of urban environments or the biodiversity of agricultural environments as well. Now, here's why genetic biodiversity is important. So if you have a lot of biodiversity in the genetics of a species, it offers protection. We're going to see at all levels biodiversity offers protection from catastrophe. So if all the organisms in a community, say cheetahs, have very low genetic biodiversity, if a disease comes along and it affects one of them, it's going to affect most of them. And so the possibility of them going extinct is quite high. Or, for instance, if you have a lot of variability within the population's genetics, then if some sort of environmental stress occurs, some of them are better adapted to handle it than others, and they might survive and then adapt and evolve over time. But if you have limited genetic diversity, that's not going to happen. Now, unfortunately, as humans, we have a tendency to be kind of one-sided and narrow-minded in our focus, and we go like, well, I want these cows that have, big milk glands, and that's all I really care about. And so we have a tendency to limit the biodiversity in the genetics of species because we find it, we're only picking for those genes that we find useful, and we don't want things that have genes that we personally don't find useful, but we're limiting the biodiversity in our organism to do that. Now, so basically, at an ecosystem level, if I have a high level of species biodiversity in an ecosystem, it's much more able to handle stresses than things that are limited in their biodiversity. So here we have a picture of a tropical rainforest, and we just take a look and we see so many plant species here. And here we just got wheat. Okay, fine, but what if a wheat blight comes along? Well, all of this gets wiped out. Or say a drought. Well, none of this is drought tolerant. Here I have lots of different species, and some of them are more tolerant of certain environmental stresses than others, of certain diseases than others. So a system that's rich in biodiversity has a tendency to endure through environmental stressors, whereas things that are limited in their biodiversity tend not to. Now, you're going to hear a lot about these two terms in this course, at least in the first semester of this course, generalist and specialist species. So a specialist species is one that has evolved to take on a very particular niche in its environment. And so they have very limited habitat they can access, very limited food they can access, and they tend to be fairly unique organisms. So these specialist species are things like, say, a panda. It can only eat bamboo. Or you could have a certain fish that can only live inside the tentacles of an anemone. So you have certain ones that are very much specialized. They've co-evolved with other organisms to do this. And then we have generalist species. Generalist species are ones that are adapted to a wide range of habitats. So you can have a big change in their habitat, and they're fine. They can adapt to anything. Some of them can adapt to living among humans, like raccoons. You know, the thing about a raccoon is it can live anywhere, it can eat anything. That's what we call a generalist species. Now, you would think generalist species would be a good thing, but it tends to limit biodiversity because they tend to succeed so well in certain environments. So a generalist species, rats, cockroaches, raccoons. Here in Korea, we have magpies, those birds, the blue and white birds you see everywhere. They're very adaptable, and they can handle a lot of different conditions. But they often, when you see them there, it often tells us there's stress in the environment and there is a problem with the biodiversity in the environment. So they tend to be indicators of unhealthy biodiversity levels. Specialist species, on the other hand, tend to be the opposite. When you have a lot of specialist species, it tells you there's a strong biodiversity in the environment. So we tend to find places that have high biodiversity have a lot of these specialist species. Take a rainforest or coral reef. They're very rich in biodiversity, and they have a lot of these specialist species that have co-evolved with other species to fill very, very specific niches in their environment. So generally speaking, the presence of specialist species is an indicator of strong biodiversity. Now, human activities can definitely disrupt ecosystems, and when we do that, we tend to put stress on the system. And unfortunately, what often happens is the specialist species do very, very poorly in this situation, and they sometimes go extinct, whereas the generalist species are able to quickly adapt to it and go, okay, well, you tore up my forest and replaced it with a mud pit. I'll just deal with the mud pit. Whereas the panda can't do this. Like, where's my bamboo? I don't see any bamboo. I'll just die. So we find is that a lot of human actions inadvertently decrease biodiversity by putting too much environmental stress on specialist species and then paving the way for the increase in generalist species. Now, the last thing I'll say about biodiversity is this, that it is you need to have large amounts of biodiverse habitat for many of the megafauna species. So the really big things that we really care about, things like orangutans and tigers and elephants. These organisms typically require very large areas in which to make their habitat. And so they need a lot of area to be protected in order to exist. If you limit their area, they die out. Compare a tiger. So a tiger, an individual tiger, mind you, needs about 20 square kilometers of territory to call its own in order to hunt and live. Remember, it's a pretty high order, high trophic order organism. Whereas like a rabbit, like one hundredth of a square kilometer will do for a rabbit. So we find is that, and again, often these generalist species, they don't need nearly the amount of habitat range that some of the more specialized species do. Okay, so that's just skimming the surface of biodiversity. We're going to talk a lot about the many facets of it in this unit. See you for now.